Welcome to my channel, Literary Aesthetics, where we explore the hidden meanings behind words and the beauty within literature. Today, we continue with Emily Bronte's timeless novel, Wuthering Heights, focusing on chapters 15, 16 and 17. In Wuthering Heights, love is never simple, and sometimes it is deadly. In chapters 15, 16, and 17, passion, grief, and revenge collide. Catherine and Heathcliff's final meeting burns with heartbreak and intensity. Catherine dies leaving a child behind, and the power at Wuthering Heights shifts forever. Today, we dive deep into these pivotal chapters to uncover the love, rage, and tragedy that shape the fate of everyone at the Heights. Let's begin with the summaries first. In chapter 15, the emotional tension between Catherine and Heathcliff reaches its tragic peak. Catherine is dangerously ill, physically weakened and mentally unstable, after refusing food and sleep. Edgar keeps himself distant, refusing to acknowledge Heathcliff's presence, but Nellie secretly allows Heathcliff to enter Catherine's room. The moment Catherine sees him, her emotions erupt. She clings to him desperately, accusing him of causing her misery and telling him he has broken her heart. She insists he left her to die and says that her heart and soul have always belonged to him, regardless of her marriage to Edgar. Heathcliff, equally tormented, blames her in return for marrying Edgar and destroying both of their lives. Their reunion is a painful mixture of love, bitterness, and despair, as though they are unable to live with or without each other. Catherine becomes hysterical, sobbing that she is dying and that Heathcliff will not mourn her enough. When Edgar discovers them together, he tries to confront Heathcliff, but Catherine collapses from exhaustion before any confrontation can happen. In her weakened state, she demands both men stop arguing, saying their fighting is killing her. Heathcliff, seeing how close she is to death, finally lets go of her, though his grief is overwhelming. The chapter closes with a heavy sense of impending tragedy. Their long-awaited reunion has only intensified their suffering, and Catherine's life now hangs in the balance. Chapter 16 opens in the aftermath of Catherine's collapse. During the night, she goes into premature labor and, after a difficult delivery, gives birth to a daughter named Cathy Linton. The joy of the newborn is immediately overshadowed by tragedy. Catherine is too weak to recover, and she dies shortly after 2 o'clock in the morning. Edgar is devastated. The news crushes him, and he shuts himself away in silent, bitter mourning. Meanwhile, when Nellie carries the news to Heathcliff, his reaction is fierce and heartbreaking. Instead of quiet sorrow, he erupts into violent grief, accusing Catherine of breaking their bond by dying and begging her spirit never to leave him alone. His agony is so deep that he calls out for her ghost to haunt him forever, believing he cannot live without her presence. Later, Heathcliff goes to Catherine's body and, overcome with passion, embraces her cold form. Nellie later reveals that he opened Catherine's coffin and replaced a lock of Edgar's hair with his own, an act symbolizing his claim to her even in death. Catherine is buried not in the Linton family vault but at the edge of the moors, a choice reflecting her wild, untamed spirit that never fully belonged to civilized life at Thrushcross Grange. The chapter ends with a haunting sense that Catherine's presence will linger beyond the grave, and that Heathcliff's grief has transformed into a dark, obsessive devotion that will influence the rest of the novel. Finally, chapter 17 begins with Nellie describing the chaos that follows Catherine's death. A few days later, Isabella appears at Thrushcross Grange in a terrified and disheveled state after fleeing Wuthering Heights. She tells Nellie and Edgar that life with Heathcliff became unbearable after Catherine died. He grew more violent, unpredictable, and consumed by rage. In her account, Isabella describes how Hindley, drunk, desperate, and full of hatred, attempted to murder Heathcliff by ambushing him with a knife and gun. Heathcliff, however, was prepared. He easily disarmed Hindley, beat him, and mocked him with cruel satisfaction. The house had become a hellish place, full of shouting, threats, and drunken quarrels, and Isabella realized that staying there meant certain misery or even death. Using Hindley's failed attack as her chance, she escaped out of the house and ran across the moors until she reached the Grange. Though Edgar receives her politely, Isabella refuses to stay with him for long and soon leaves the area entirely, choosing exile in the south over any connection to Heathcliff. Meanwhile, Hindley, ruined by drink and despair, continues to deteriorate physically and emotionally. His debts to Heathcliff grow so large that when Hindley eventually dies, briefly mentioned in the chapter, Heathcliff inherits full control of Wuthering Heights. By the end of the chapter, Heathcliff stands as the undisputed master of the Heights, and the Earnshaw family's downfall is complete. The chapter marks a significant turning point, revealing Heathcliff's growing power, the collapse of Hindley, and the spreading consequences of Catherine's death. Now coming towards critical analysis of these chapters. Chapter 15 is one of the most emotionally intense and thematically significant chapters in Wuthering Heights. It dramatizes the tragic, destructive, and spiritually entwined relationship between Catherine and Heathcliff, revealing how their love transcends conventional boundaries yet simultaneously destroys them both. 1. The complex nature of Catherine and Heathcliff's love. The chapter highlights Bronte's portrayal of love as something wild, irrational, and destructive, not romantic or gentle. Catherine and Heathcliff's reunion is filled with accusations, bitterness, and passion. They cannot express love without simultaneously expressing pain. Catherine blames Heathcliff for killing her with neglect, and Heathcliff blames her for betraying him by marrying Edgar. Their love is a paradox. It sustains them emotionally, but destroys them mentally and physically. This makes their relationship the central tragedy of the novel, two souls who belong together but are unable to coexist peacefully. 2. Identity and the "I am Heathcliff" concept. This chapter reinforces Catherine's earlier claim that, "I am Heathcliff." Even as she is dying, she clings to him as though he is an extension of her own being. Their reunion reveals the depth of their shared identity. Catherine's illness is partly a symptom of emotional rupture. Heathcliff feels her suffering as his own. Their connection is portrayed as elemental, almost supernatural. Brontë uses this chapter to show that their bond is beyond ordinary human love. It is spiritual, instinctive, and inseparable, making Catherine's dying state catastrophic for both. 3. Conflict between two worlds. Nature versus civilization. Chapter 15 vividly dramatizes the conflict between the wild world of Wuthering Heights, Heathcliff, and the civilized world of Thrushcross Grange, Edgar. Heathcliff enters the Grange like a dark force, disrupting the quiet order Edgar tries to maintain. The room itself becomes a symbolic battleground. Catherine represents the torn figure between the two worlds. Heathcliff embodies passion, revenge, and raw emotion. Edgar stands for decorum and social propriety. Catherine's collapse during the confrontation symbolizes how these opposing forces tear her apart. She is the tragic victim of the clash between two incompatible systems of life and love. 4. Emotional violence and Gothic intensity. The chapter is saturated with Gothic elements, intense emotions, physical collapse, stormy feelings, and death foreshadowing. Catherine and Heathcliff's dialogue borders on violent passion. She grips him, he cannot let go, and their emotional turmoil seems to drain life from her. This moment conveys the self-destructive force of Gothic love, where passion becomes a threat to physical survival. Through this, Brontë challenges the Victorian ideal of calm, reasonable affection. 5. The tragedy of miscommunication and pride. Another layer in this chapter is the tragedy of what could have been. Catherine and Heathcliff never fully understand each other's motives. Pride, anger, and jealousy blind them both. Their reunion shows that their most honest conversation happens too late, only on the brink of death. Brontë suggests that timing and communication are central to tragedy. Their love is doomed not only because of society but because of their own emotional immaturity. 6. Conclusion. Chapter 15 is the emotional heart of the novel. Critically, Chapter 15 is the emotional core of the entire book. It captures the essence of Catherine and Heathcliff's relationship, one defined by fierce devotion, unbearable pain, and catastrophic consequences. It bridges the living world and the ghostly one, marking the transition from Catherine's earthly existence to her role as the haunting force that shapes the rest of the narrative. Let's critically analyze Chapter 16 now. Chapter 16 is one of the most haunting and emotionally charged chapters in the novel. It presents the death of Catherine Earnshaw, the birth of her daughter, and Heathcliff's violent spiritual reaction. The chapter symbolically closes the first generation and opens the second, while bringing the novel's Gothic and psychological elements to their peak. 1. Death and birth. A Gothic juxtaposition. One of the most significant artistic choices in this chapter is the simultaneous birth of Cathy and death of Catherine. This contrast symbolizes the cycle of life and death, the replacement of one generation with another, the continuation of Catherine through her daughter. Cathy's birth is not celebrated, instead, it highlights the tragedy of Catherine's death. Brontë presents life itself as shadowed by suffering, reinforcing the bleak Gothic atmosphere. 2. Catherine's death as a transformation, not an ending. Catherine's death is not treated as final. In fact, Chapter 16 intensifies the sense that Catherine will remain a spiritual presence. Heathcliff's reaction makes this clear. His grief is violent, almost supernatural. He begs Catherine to haunt him, saying he cannot live if she leaves him in peace. This moment transforms Catherine from a human character into a Gothic, ghostly force, preparing the reader for her later appearances as a spectral presence. Brontë makes death a doorway, not a closure. 3. Heathcliff's grief, passion beyond human limits. Heathcliff's reaction to Catherine's death has become one of the most famous scenes in Victorian literature. It reveals the extremity of his emotional and psychological nature. His grief is raw and uncontrollable, violent and spiritual, self-destructive. Instead of mourning quietly, he rages, curses, and embraces Catherine's body with desperate longing. His plea, asking her not to rest in heaven but to remain near him, exposes the obsessive, possessive quality of his love. This is not a romantic grief, it is a Gothic, elemental outburst that erases the boundary between life and death. 4. Identity and the fusion of souls. Chapter 16 develops the idea that Catherine and Heathcliff share a single identity. When Catherine dies, it feels as though a part of Heathcliff also dies. His grief is not for a beloved woman, it is for the loss of his own soul's counterpart. Brontë pushes the theme of identity to an extreme. Catherine lives on inside Heathcliff. Her death fractures his selfhood. His future actions, revenge on Hindley, Edgar, and their children, are driven by this spiritual destruction. This chapter shows that their relationship is not simply emotional but metaphysical. 5. Nature and the moors. Catherine's burial. The decision to bury Catherine on the edge of the moors is thematically important. The moors symbolize freedom, wildness, and Catherine's true spirit. Her burial site rejects the civilized world of the Lintons, aligns her with the natural, untamed landscape, foreshadows her later ghostly presence wandering the moors. Brontë uses geography to express character. Catherine belonged neither to Edgar's refined world nor fully to Heathcliff's darkness, she belonged to the moors. 6. Edgar's silent grief versus Heathcliff's wild grief. Edgar's reaction is quiet, controlled, deeply human. Heathcliff's is violent, spiritual, almost inhuman. The contrast highlights the emotional divide between the Linton and Earnshaw worlds, the difference between civilized sorrow, Edgar, and elemental anguish, Heathcliff, the tragedy of Catherine being torn between these two men and their opposing worlds. Brontë uses this contrast to critique Victorian ideals of emotional restraint. 7. Opening of the second generation. Cath's birth marks the beginning of the second generation, whose story will mirror the first but ultimately move toward healing. Catherine's death ends the destructive romantic tragedy of the first half and shifts the novel into a new phase centered around Cathy, Hareton, and Linton Heathcliff. Thus, Chapter 16 is both an ending and a beginning, a hinge in the narrative structure. Chapter 16 is the spiritual climax of Wuthering Heights. Catherine's death, Heathcliff's violent grief, and the Gothic atmosphere create a chapter where emotion overwhelms reason, and life merges with death. Brontë uses this moment to reshape the novel from a story of destructive love into one haunted by the past, preparing the ground for the tragedies and eventual resolutions of the second generation. Now finally coming towards the critical analysis of Chapter 17. Chapter 17 serves as a bridge between the emotional devastation of Catherine's death and the emerging patterns of conflict in the next generation. It is a chapter charged with violence, psychological tension, and major power shifts. Through Isabella's escape and Hindley's downfall, Brontë deepens the novel's exploration of cruelty, revenge, and the consequences of unchecked passion. 1. Heathcliff's descent into greater darkness. After Catherine's death, Heathcliff becomes even more vengeful and volatile, and Chapter 17 shows the beginning of his full transformation into a tyrant. His cruelty toward Isabella intensifies, not because of anything she has done, but because she is connected, however indirectly, to Edgar and Catherine. This brutality reflects Heathcliff's moral and emotional collapse, shows how grief can turn into destructive rage, marks the beginning of his domination over Wuthering Heights. Brontë presents Heathcliff not as a romantic tragic hero, but as a deeply damaged, increasingly cruel figure whose obsession has become toxic. 2. Isabella's escape, a feminist moment. Isabella's escape is one of the few moments in the novel where a female character actively takes control of her fate. Instead of remaining a passive victim, she chooses to flee and reclaim her autonomy. Through Isabella, Brontë critiques the oppressive nature of Victorian marriage, the vulnerability of women in toxic relationships, the lack of legal, social protection for married women. Isabella's decision to leave the Heights, and later to leave the region altogether, represents one of the most radical acts of agency in the novel. 3. Hindley's ruin, cycles of violence. Hindley's downfall reaches its peak here. He is fully destroyed, physically and psychologically. His attempt to murder Heathcliff is not just a moment of violence, it is the tragic climax of years of resentment, guilt, and alcoholism. Hindley's collapse symbolizes the destruction of the Earnshaw family line, the inevitable consequences of neglect and abuse. Heathcliff's long-awaited revenge nearing completion. Bronte's portrayal suggests a tragic cycle. Hindley abused Heathcliff in childhood. Now Heathcliff destroys him in adulthood. 4. Heathcliff's seizure of Wuthering Heights. One of the most important narrative developments occurs quietly. Heathcliff becomes master of Wuthering Heights through Hindley's debts. This signifies the shift of power from the Earnshaws to Heathcliff, the completion of Heathcliff's economic revenge, a turning point for the whole novel's power structure. What was once the Earnshaw home has now become Heathcliff's domain, physically, emotionally, and symbolically. 5. Gothic violence and moral decay. The atmosphere in this chapter is dominated by Gothic elements: violence, dark, chaotic interiors, drunkenness and madness, twisted human relationships. Wuthering Heights becomes a place of moral rot, reflecting Heathcliff's inner destruction. Brontë uses the setting to mirror the psychological collapse of its inhabitants. 6. Isabella's narrative, reliability and perspective. Isabella's retelling of events is highly emotional and subjective. Her perspective exposes Heathcliff's sadism, reveals the breakdown of social order at the Heights, adds layers of psychological realism. Her voice gives the chapter a confessional, almost claustrophobic quality, showing the reader a first-hand account of Heathcliff's tyranny. 7. Transitional role. Ending one era, beginning another. Chapter 17 ends the narrative of the first generation. Catherine, Hindley, and Isabella all exit this stage of the story. It prepares the ground for the second generation by giving Heathcliff total power and removing the old forces that previously opposed him. It is the end of the Earnshaw-Linton conflict, the beginning of Heathcliff shaping the lives of Cathy, Hareton, and Linton, a structural hinge in the novel. The story becomes darker, more controlled by Heathcliff, and more psychologically oppressive. Chapter 17 is a pivotal chapter rich in violence, transformation, and symbolic power shifts. Through Isabella's escape, Hindley's ruin, and Heathcliff's rise, Emily Brontë deepens the novel's themes of revenge, tyranny, and the cycle of trauma. This chapter marks the moment when Wuthering Heights falls completely under Heathcliff's control, setting the stage for the tragedies of the next generation. In short, these chapters deepen the tension and complexity of the characters' relationships. Heathcliff's obsessive love for Catherine continues to drive his cruel and manipulative behavior, while Catherine's struggle between passion and social ambition becomes more evident. The emotional turbulence affects everyone around them, revealing the destructive power of unrestrained desire and revenge. Key events, such as Heathcliff's return and his subtle plotting, set the stage for the novel's darker developments, highlighting the themes of obsession, social class, and the consequences of unresolved love. That's all for the summary and analysis of chapters 15, 16, and 17 of Wuthering Heights. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for the next video, where we'll cover Volume 1 as a whole, summarizing all the chapters and highlighting the most important events, themes, and critical points of this unforgettable story.